Go. Okay. Great. So yes, welcome everybody to Impact Action 3. Thank you for joining us here today. It's our third session in the Impact and Action series. So there we go. So yeah, we're very excited today to be joined by Alan Chandler of University of East London for his production of Heritage. Now, Impact and Action is a series we run just to basically give an opportunity for various individuals to showcase some of their impact work, some of the great impact they're making across a variety of different spheres. So yes, I mean, if you are interested in presenting at a future one, then do please get in touch. There'll be some details later on, or mentioned in the chat. Some of the feedback we had last time was just to run a bit longer to allow for any questions. So as long as Alan, you're available, then we'll keep the floor open for the questions following the presentation, basically. So yes, please do use chat to do those. My colleague Andy will be managing all the questions and will be serving those up at the end. And I think with that, Alan, would you like to take over?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's a funny thing to be offered a slot to kind of tell everybody what you do. It's nice to do it. It's also like, what the hell reception am I going to get? So we'll see what you think. I've got a slideshow, which I'll go through in sort of rapid fire fashion. Yeah, it's the kind of research that isn't normal academic research, in the sense that I'm also a conservation architect, and I teach in architecture, but I'm also the Dean of Research at UEL. So that gives you some indication that UEL rather likes practice-driven research rather than pure, which I'm rather proud of. So I'll share my screen and we should begin. There we go, share. Is that working, folks? Yeah. Hopefully that's working.
I can see that, yeah.
Yeah. So it's called the production of heritage, and within that are questions of authenticity, and that sort of sums up my work as a practitioner, but also my teaching work with architecture students, and it kind of infects some of the life projects that we do at UEL as well. So conservation is the preeminent tool for addressing questions of belonging in a decolonial context. So our built spaces are the history that we walk in. It's not abstract, it's not filtered by privileged authorship, and it's our task to interpret, reveal, repair, and place ourselves critically within the spaces that we all inhabit. So the question for me, teaching, practice, research, why are they segregated in terms of TEF, KEF, and REF? I don't know is the answer, so I ignore that differentiation, as you can probably gather from this slideshow. Research can define the particular or redefine the relation between things, and I think that's where it gets interesting. So emphasizing the value of the particular leaves gaps between chunks of knowledge. Missing their relational value leaves meaning stranded if we're not careful. So going back to the kind of the subject matter, fairly big themes, heritage. For me, it's just a cipher for research into relational value. Excuse me. Heritage is, by definition, to inherit. So it's the valued object or quality that's been passed across generations. It's an inheritance. Features belonging to a culture of a particular society, created in the past, but still having historical importance, so we can kind of respect it at one level. I introduced the word production in there. To bring forth is the action of making or manufacturing from components or raw materials. So the harvesting or refinement of something natural. So creating or exploiting, they're both wrapped up in that word, and it's a kind of choice about how we look at the subject of heritage. And the final word that I threw in there at the beginning, orange, is authentic, which is a key word, I think. So it's from the Greek authentikos, to master. So it's of undisputed origin and not a copy. So it's genuine. So that's most people's understanding of authentic. It's also, if you look up the definition, made or done in the traditional or original way, or in a way that it faithfully resembles. Now, that's interesting because that means that authenticity is both a material historic reality and a contemporary convincing facsimile. So that's the problem, isn't it? So it's the real thing, and it's also something which is a facsimile of the real thing. So that's perhaps why truth and lies are so conveniently interchangeable in contemporary culture. So if we hold on to the original, surely we can secure authenticity. That's the preeminent idea of most kind of heritage practice. So quick look at Venice, useful sort of thought there. So this building is in Venice. This is a daguerreotype by Ruskin in 1849. The thing I draw your attention to is the washing line. Here you can see it uploaded by iPhone. You can find it on most sort of sites. The difference? Well, there's no washing. Yeah? So what does that tell us? That tells us that ownership and social production is the soft context for authenticity. The meaning of material is entirely defined by cultural rights and habitual rights. Conserving the container does not guarantee the fate of its content or its washing. So for me, I'd like to think that heritage is perhaps an alternative means of production. So the ongoing use of heritage is a form of cultural capital, and the disenfranchisement of historic buildings from common use is an aspect, I would suggest, of social appropriation. Understanding the production of heritage as a political act is William Morris's legacy, this being William Morris, in case you didn't know. And it's also our right to exercise. So this political aspect of heritage is something I'm particularly interested in, and it's something that informs a lot of my work. So just by chance, my practice and my teaching coalesce. So I was going to give you a kind of little run through of some of the kind of interfaces between practice and research. This is St Pancras Church in Euston in London, listed grade 1. So the project was to deal with lead, stone and terracotta and repairing their connections. Now, it won the 2016 John Betjeman Award for Church Conservation from the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which William Morris founded in 1877. So I was interested in what William Morris thought about this kind of building, particularly as I won the award. So I'll quote from him. Now, there is by way another kindred material to brick, and that is the cast brick they call terracotta. I cannot abide it, I must say. And he goes on to tell you why, even though he thinks he doesn't need to treat it any further. So what we can see is that William Morris thinks that, in a way, it's not really a material. It's not really an official thing. It's not a brick. It's not carving. And he thinks it has this kind of fatal ease of ornamentation. It's kind of too easy. It doesn't involve the kind of craft that he was interested in. And he wrote this in 1891. So I think I needed to rework on that because I'd been spending rather a long time and then won an award in his name, thinking about terracotta and how we restore it. And then he comes along and says it's complete garbage. So I had to reconcile that in my head. So I did, and that's part of the idea of research being this kind of like, I've got an impasse, I've got a problem, how are we going to kind of drill through this and find a way to an interesting position. So Morris felt that the work of architecture made with skill for utility within a craft-based employment structure created art by default and not by design. So that was his starting point. So the process of terracotta for him was neither molded nor cast, because in fact it's actually both, but it does result in an imitation of carving. So back to this authenticity question. He thought it just gathered dirt. It was an inappropriate delicacy for an exterior that should be reserved for the interior. So this is a kind of interesting position to take on architecture. And indeed, should a department store have the same architectural language as a cathedral? Here we have Harrods and Ely. So where does that leave terracotta? That was the question for me. So cheap alternative to stonework, dismissed as inauthentic by Morris, who far preferred the idea of the work of medieval guilds. That's a problem. So I looked at this idea of authenticity, which is why I threw that word in at the beginning. And in fact, terracotta was used by the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Minoans and the Etruscans. It was adopted by the Romans. It was revived in the Italian Renaissance by Palladio, and then Inigo Jones and Kent and Burlington then borrowed it for the emerging British Empire. So it's a very interesting material. So what truth should we look for? What is this thing about authenticity? Where do we start? What's the original? How far back should we look? So I think authenticity is the wrong word to apply to terracotta, but I'm on a roll with my research, so I'm going to keep going, right? So we can argue that although terracotta isn't real stone, we could say that actually it's in line with the common use of terracotta in Greek temple architecture. So Charles Waldstein, in one of his essays on the Phaedrus, discovered that there were examples of terracotta statues in the Louvre, which were actually prototypes for this, which we all know is now sitting in the British Museum, and it's this frieze from the Acropolis. So we're still finding out that this idea of authenticity is a bit weird, because if authenticity is simply a copy, how come the copy in this case is also part of the original? So in the 1st century AD, terracotta was part of the material lexicon for Greek temples. It's a refinement of the ceramic process specifically for architectural decoration. This is an acroterion, it's a terracotta temple figure. So the reason you would use terracotta is that it's lightweight, cheap, reproducible, you know, all those kind of capitalist ideas. They were present way back. So we simply acknowledge that they're useful and borrow them, same as we borrowed the language of architecture. So was imitation or historicism really the key to Morris's objections to terracotta? I'm still not satisfied, you can tell, can't you? So Greek sculpture and the culture of perfection is a kind of benchmark of naturalism in art. And it shaped the post-Enlightenment view of the way statehood is manifest through art, which is basically political high realism. So every European empire or aspirational empire has adopted, in principle, this way of defining its cultural output. So the Romans, British, American, Napoleonic France, Stalin's Russia, even the Third Reich. So it's not surprising that Morris, who was a pre-Raphaelite, saw this artistic legacy in an unfavorable light. So he saw the medieval period not as a dark age between periods of civilization, but actually as something far more fundamentally valuable and social. And he actually took exception to this idea of civilization. Meantime, the cultivated Greek citizen, there seems nothing wrong or burdensome in chattel slavery, and noted that the cultivated gentleman of Greece or England feels themselves to be such a precious and finished fruit of civilization that he's worth any amount of suffering, injustice, or brutality in the mass of mankind below him. So he actually had a problem with the politics of classicism, and the aesthetics of it was simply a sign of that. So artistically and politically, Morris had an issue with terracotta. This makes winning the John Betjeman Award really rather ironic. If, however, as he also states, a building is a document to learn from, then St. Pancras gives us a socio-political narrative readable through an attention to detail, material and technique, which takes us into a whole new realm of thinking about heritage. So this is St. Pancras Church. It's an unrivaled example of Greek revival architecture. So William Henry Inwood, who was in Athens at the time when he won the competition for this. Competitions aren't new, they're pretty old hat these days. And he brought plaster casts and fragments back from the Erechtheum on the Acropolis. So this is the Erechtheum, this is the original. But again, we're looking at this word authentic really rather critically. And so we have to actually note at this point that all the things you can see in this picture are copies. One of the original figures is in the museum, which is 900, which is down at the base of the Acropolis. In fact, 3 of them are. One of them, however, is 900 meters away from St. Pancras Church in the British Museum. So what you see on the Acropolis is not authentic. This is the copy, which is from St. Pancras Church, made by John Felix Rossi. Unlike the figures on the Acropolis, each of these at St. Pancras hold an extinguished torch or empty jug, which reflects their position as guardians of the dead as they stand above the doorways to the crypt, which takes 10,000 bodies, one of whom is Charles Felix Rossi. So, in acknowledging the use of terracotta at St. Pancras as part of a heritage of Greek decoration, as well as an imitation of it, we should look in detail at the history within the technique, not merely at the stonecraft that supplants it. How is this political, social, technical, historical, and critical potential of a material operationalized for contemporary communities? So this idea that we gather from looking intimately at a material, what it means, and what its language is and signifies, gives us an opportunity to reflect on that and to operationalize it for new research. So this is research that was done last year in my university. It was conceived with Lynn McCarthy, who's a senior lecturer in performance, in partnership with the Victorian Albert Museum, as part of their Questions of Clay research with Thesta Gates, who's a fantastic Detroit-based artist. If you don't know his work, do check it out. So the Question of Clay explores history, significance, and meaning, using clay itself as this kind of tool. And part of the research that I really support in UEL is this idea of kind of pragmatic materials-based stuff with its critical potential unlocked. So in May 2021, a Brickworks was set up in Newham, bringing communities together to look at the material culture of a place through bricks. And as many of you know, London is founded on clay, it's built from the ground it stands on, and that process becomes kind of an interesting kind of tool for engagement. So the whole project showed the historical, social and cultural meanings found within a material and the processes by which it's manufactured. So if we look at the historical maps, we can often find places called brickfields. I live in Camden Town and my house sits on one, and it's made from the ground it stands on, as I say. What's interesting though is that the bricks were made by the poorest families in London, and usually the entire family, children and all. So we have to understand that the kind of the wealth and gravity of the city that surrounds us, particularly the Georgian and the Victorian city, was generated from the backs of the poorest. So understanding that, then gathering people together around this action of making bricks is a way of reflecting on that kind of legacy, and also of understanding the role that we now play in contemporary culture, connecting back to that past. So we made bricks, lots of bricks. We built a kiln, we built and fired the bricks. So this idea of coming together, of generating things, of Lynn students putting on performances and talking about the kind of the history and the cultural significance of the place, brought people together, kind of banging between two separate pandemics. So these bricks were built and made, and we're now looking at opportunities to work with communities to co-curate a proposal to actually build something for them. And of course, the added advantage is that if you use lime mortar, then you can always recycle the bricks, giving it a further life or lives. So if we define the production of heritage as making, which is generative, rather than harvesting, which is exploitative, then we have the possibility to reshape production. History constantly changes, but is always present. History is the documentation of human activity. When it stops, new human activity makes new space, which makes history. New always gets built on or in old. New is immediately old. The question is which old becomes new old, and which old stays old. And that's something that we have to define. Very happy to take any questions from that little slideshow.
Great, thank you very much, Alan. It's fascinating. I suppose I've got a question. Where do you see the bricks going next? What's kind of the next stage of that?
We had that second pandemic, which slightly got in the way of sort of affecting everybody's minds on what we do in the large pile of bricks. So I'm literally restarting that conversation now that we officially don't have a pandemic according to the government. It's debatable, but anyway. So yeah, it's an ongoing project, and we're looking at that at the moment. There's a sort of an interesting opportunity around the 10-year anniversary of the Olympics, which is where we are in London. And the Olympics was a very interesting and divisive project. The displacement of people and opportunities from the site, balancing with the opportunities and importation of people that is facilitated. So we're looking at using the bricks possibly in a temporary fashion around those festivities, not to challenge the Olympics per se, but just to propose that kind of alternative conversation around when something arrives, something else has to leave, and how is that judged and how is that balanced and understood culturally. So that's potentially where some of the bricks will end up.
Okay, great, thank you. So anyone else have any questions on the session?
While we're waiting for others, I've got a question, Alan, if I may. Firstly, thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. What sort of prompted your initial research into terracotta, like specifically?
Well, it was led from simply having to restore it. The bits of it were falling off. There was all sorts of problems with the church. And so it wasn't a material I particularly thought about before doing this. My main materials research is in fabric formed concrete, which is a million miles away from my conservation practice. But the kind of rigor that you apply to questioning any kind of material, you start applying to this. So in this case, we started off very pragmatic kind of questions about how you keep the thing on, how you have to take it apart and put it back together again. I'm currently doing a research project with Historic England on how this terracotta repairs weather over time. So we're doing a monitoring exercise on the church. So that's one sort of side of quite standard technical research. But for me, this question of, William Morris says it's crap. But it's quite nice, really. Why does he say it's crap? Winning that award forced me to confront this. And then you go off down this kind of meaning route. So, what it just emphasized to me is that whatever you look at, you have a set of kind of practical and sort of material kind of physics, but you also have the cultural load that comes alongside materials and places. And you kind of can't do one without the other. Well, some people can, but then it's slightly more dimensional. And I think what's interesting is when you start looking at any kind of given place or problem or thing from a practical and cultural dimension, because that changes the way it can operate. And then part of the research is communicating that question critically and inviting people to kind of participate in that conversation, because often research in universities is very technical, it's very elitist, not many people can get a hold of it. And as long as you get 10 people who subscribe to that journal to read it, then you get your citations. That for me is not enough. I think we need to have research that's completely public. And the only way to do that is to find ways of communicating and bringing people together around the research so they actually understand the relevance of it. And you just need to find different ways of talking to people. It's not about talking down, it's just about talking out.
Yeah, brilliant. No, thank you very much for that. And I've got another question just while we wait on any more that come in. You mentioned that the lime water content actually makes bricks recyclable. Would you mind just talking a little bit more about that? The only reason I ask is I used to work in the recycling industry, and it's of particular interest to me, specifically focusing on sort of the sustainability of bricks, which I'm sure most of us aren't aware of.
I'm not going to bore you all to death with kind of mortar mixes, but cement, contemporary cement made from Portland stone is very brittle. It's also a really good adhesive. So it ends up, when it's fully cured, being far harder than the bricks that it's gluing together. So if you want to demolish your wall, you'll find that the bricks break before the cement does, leaving you with a pile of rubble. So all it's fit for is kind of sticking under a slab or something. So up until the widespread use of Portland cement in the 20th century, end of the 19th, we use lime. Now, lime is interesting because it's kind of calcium carbonate, and it dries and sets over a long period of time, but it never will achieve a hardness greater than the bricks, which means you can just knock it off. So you can salvage all of your bricks intact. So a lot of the reclaimed bricks you'll find are all from the Victorian period, Georgian period, even Tudor period, but you won't get a lot of recycled 20th century bricks because they're basically hardcore. So this idea that you would dig the ground, form a brick, cook it at 1,000 degrees centigrade, and then crunch it up and throw it away seems like a very stupid idea if you're trying to sustain the planet. So if we just simply go back 100 or so years, we find that we'd already solved that problem, and we then forgot to solve the problem. So this constant pursuit of technical performance and often brittleness is sometimes actually in the wrong direction in terms of sustainability. So if we use lime mortar, which is lime mixed with sand, you will be able to salvage every single brick.
Brilliant. I had absolutely no idea. No, thank you for that. We've got a question from Russell, I think.
And we've got another one from Jean. So I'll allow Russell to speak first, and then there's a question from Jean in the question and answer. Okay.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. That was a fabulous talk, really fascinating. I've been involved in the design and the construction of buildings for quite a while. I'm actually at the University of Central Lancashire, but nothing to do with the construction or architecture side. I was the director of the Design and Mental Health Network for about 10 years, and we were involved in the process of building medium secure psychiatric units from a point of view of enhancing the patient experience. But what we experienced time and time again, and I sat down with architects and builders, that the design process was often costed out of the final build. I mean, those buildings that you're talking about now, which would be amazing, I wonder how that reflects in this modern world we're looking at now. And just to add on to that, I'm involved in building some property in Norfolk at the moment. And another thing's happening now is some of the materials we would like to use that are purely cosmetic, we just can't do because of the length of time to manufacture them. So we're having to use a sort of inferior material. I'll leave that with you, Alan.
Well, welcome to the 21st century.
Yeah.
Basically. I mean, St Pancras Church cost more to build than St Paul's Cathedral did, if you look at the 100 or so years difference. So it was the most expensive church in London in history at the time it was built. So that gives you some idea how they could waste money. So yeah, we are looking at kind of the top end of achieving buildings, it must be said. My house isn't anything like that. Yeah, I mean, there is a question, and I think this kind of approaching materials from a cultural perspective angle is relevant here, because I think we do need to understand the importance and impact of materials in a cultural way. It's not just pounds, shillings, and pence. It's not just like spreadsheet, bottom line stuff, because that has consequences. It has consequences for the people who use it. It also has consequences for the planet, because you can't recycle it. It's not part of the circular economy. So when you cut all the corners off, you just get a round lump, which is not much help. So we need corners, right? We need to be able to bed things together. We need to make connections between things. And too often the procurement process completely eradicates that. I'm also a chair of the RIBA Conservation Register Committee, looking after accreditation of conservation architects in the UK. And I am in frequent argumentative conversation with the RIBA, because the bit where there's the kind of consultation bit is termed work stage 0 and has no fee attached to it in the plan of work that architects follow, which is like unacceptable. You know, if you don't get those conversations right, you get the wrong building or a bad building or both. So, you know, I think the profession, my profession, is chasing money, as are many other professionals in the world of providing buildings for people. Costs are king, and we find ourselves racing to the bottom, which we shouldn't be doing. So, to fairness to the RIBA, they are trying to promote the kind of buildings that do respond to the care of people. They've just given the RIBA gold medal to Doshi, who's an Indian architect who does exactly that in India. And it's about co-curating buildings with communities and understanding what they need and providing them in a way which is both enlightening and also part of a broader question of circular economy, so that we're looking at the future. So I completely agree with you. And I think the ability to find the materials that we need, given the issues of globalization and production, given the lack of investment in materials production and skills in this country over the last however many years since Thatcher came to power, you know, means that if we want to buy London stock bricks, they're actually made in Turkey. Which is fine. I have no problem in supporting industries in Turkey, but let's not pretend that they're London bricks, shall we? So, you know, I think we are on the point of my research is actually everything you look at in terms of historic buildings is actually about capitalism and culture moving forward, and is totally relevant to now. So that's what I tell my students, is that it's not about something back then, it's actually about tomorrow.
Thanks, Alan. Great answer. Thank you very much.
Was there a next question in the chat?
Yeah, there's one in the Q&A function. I can read it out. So, so it's from Jean at Greenwich. Imagine that the understanding of the value of this participatory work for the communities involved Newham base at this stage will be primarily political in nature and context. How would you describe the benefits for the participants, current and intended, in terms of potentially applying the implied awareness of current inequalities derived from participating in your projects to their intended or future behaviour?
I can illustrate a project which I was part of that for me sets the kind of benchmark for how projects ought to be. It's a project called Old Tab Alley Park. It's opposite the Whitechapel Art Gallery in Whitechapel, and it was by a friend and colleague who works in Muff Architects, and they asked me to help create some pieces for the park because I do concretes with these kind of concrete pieces. So they approached the park in a very interesting way. It is named after an Asian postal worker, military textile worker, who was murdered by racists in the 70s. Previous to that, it was the home of two separate churches, one of which Charles I had his head cut off in, something like that. So there was this ruined church underneath park. So that was its kind of heritage, but it got overlaid with these events of the 1970s. And so they had to regenerate this park. So in order to do that, they organised a series of archaeological digs with the Museum of London, where all the local Bengali kids from the schools came in and they started digging and they started finding these little fragments. And that whole process was articulating the connection that those children of first generation migrants were actually part of this place. This territory was their territory. So all of these little fragments we combined into these kind of layered concrete walls that form part of the kind of the planning and execution of the park. So the act of bringing the children together to dig and to become involved materially with this site, which then becomes part of the site itself, kind of beds that site, not just in the current community, but it also references and draws on what went before. And that act of bringing heritage and contemporary life together is something that, as Russell has noted, most architects don't talk about, most conservation architects don't talk about, and yet it's absolutely intrinsic to what it means for people. Because if people aren't going to become custodians of the past, then you might as well not keep it, because it won't last, it will just fall down. So we need to make sure that people understand the value of something and own something about the past. And so I guess my answer to that kind of question was curating those kind of comings together, co-curating the conservation of historic spaces leads to ownership. And that's the only way that they're going to kind of pay their way in the end. Any other questions? Chat button.
Doesn't look like it.
No problem.
Okay. I think if there are, we can. There's a chance to respond. We'll send out the recording and everything. People have chances to ask them. So I can relay any further questions to you after the event.
Absolutely fine. No problem.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alan. This was great. Really interesting projects. Interesting to see that kind of cultural impact, but also the kind of, like you say, almost changed way of conducting research as well, which sounds it sounds like it's going to have a really useful impact going forward as well, just with the kind of methodology as well. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for also attending today. Hope you enjoyed the session as well. And yeah, we will be sending out the recording in due course. And if you do have an interest in presenting at a future event, then there will be the opportunity to do that as well. And I think with that, we'll wrap up. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, thanks for joining. See you next time.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, Alex. Cheers, Andy.